Hi everyone, and welcome to today's online lesson. We're going to be focusing on the British sector of the Western Front in this lesson, which is just an introduction to the trenches part of our course of paper 1. All right, so with that said, let's get straight into it. This course is generally speaking about skills, all right? It's a highly skilled paper, and it's about 10% of your whole GCSE. So keeping in mind that the trenches course, medicine is 20%. Add this to it, so the whole of paper 1 is about 30%. You'll consider in this course the terrain of trench warfare. So what was it like out in the battlefields, out in no man's land, and the trench design. How medical treatment advanced while we're during the war. So obviously we've got loads of wounded soldiers to essentially practice on. That made them get better at the techniques. The types of injuries and illnesses of a World War One soldier. So we'll focus on in this course on the injuries and the illnesses that they had. And there's a bit of a subtle difference there. We need to make sure we understand both injuries and illnesses. And in that lesson later on, you will definitely understand that. Developments of surgery in this course. So how has surgery improved? Obviously, the more you do something, the better at it you get. And in lots of cases, these soldiers were probably on the brink of death. So what the surgeons were able to do was essentially practice without really any worry, essentially, of killing someone, because they were probably going to die anyway. So with that, they found new techniques and new ways of doing things that have then gone on to become the standard in surgery today. So out of the horrors of World War One, it's probably fair to say there was some positives in terms of our surgical advances. Right, so the nuts and bolts of this part of our exam paper in paper 1 is what you do with sources. How useful are sources? And we need to be figuring out what makes a source useful. But the key thing that you have to keep in mind for all of this is that all sources are useful. Please don't go down the route of criticizing a source, for example, saying, oh, it was made after what the fact, or there's only one picture, therefore it's only useful for one bit. Just avoid all that. Just be positive in everything that you say. The sources are always useful. There's something in every source that makes it useful, all right? So we'll talk a little bit now in this part of the lesson on the skills, on the technique, if you like, of the exam paper, what you need to do to make sure that you get maximum marks, all right? Obviously, knowledge is important, but in this part of the paper, there's a lot about technique, and if you get this bit wrong, it doesn't matter what you know, really. So we'll look at this source in two ways. I tell you, my students, to use COP, which, firstly, if you remember in your exam, you sat there and you think, right, COP, I know I need to do these three things, C, O, and P. So make your notes now in your book or on your Google Doc, however you're doing this. And if you're watching this as a revision exercise as you approach your exams, then it should just be a little recap of COP. So the C in COP, the first thing you need to make reference to after you've said how useful the source is, and the source will be useful, I don't know, it'd be very useful for an inquiry into, I don't know, injuries on the Western Front. So there'll be a clear question that you need to be talking about, and you need to make sure you're referencing and focusing on that question and to say why it's useful. Don't just say it's useful for a random thing. It has to relate to the question. And we'll do this a lot more over this little trenches course, and as you watch these videos, that will not be a problem come exam time. But for now, the initial problem sometimes people do is they see a source, they just write everything they think they can about it, and it isn't actually relating to the focus of the question. But for now, the skills is content. You need to write down what you can learn from the source. What does this thing actually tell us or show us? And it can be written and it can be a picture, all right? But in real life, away from the exam paper, a source can be anything that essentially is a source of information. All right, and we'll talk about some ideas of sources in a minute, but key stage 3, you've definitely been working on sources, diaries, photographs, newspapers, videos, all sorts of things, a source of information. So the basics that we'll think about when it comes to the technique of this part of the exam is, what does the source tell us about whatever the focus of the question is? So that's the most important bit. Source C in this case shows blah, 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 blah. And we'll have a little practice in a minute, but essentially you're going to say something about how it shows some soldiers carrying another soldier. Now, also, always in the source is a bit of writing at the top. It's called the provenance. That will give you a bit of a hint or a bit of a clue as to what the source is showing us or trying to tell us, and you need to use that information in your answer as well. So that covers the C. For me, that's the easy bit, because you can see it, you can say it. If you're having the worst day ever in your exam, at least with the source question, what you can get something out of what you see. So don't be afraid to actually say what you see, all right? And don't try and be too clever about it. Literally say what you see. And then what you do with that information is where you're going to get some marks, especially when we get to the O, all right? So O in COP is own knowledge. So something that you know that you can relate to the observation, to the content. So you've picked something out of the source, that's fine, that's easy. Then you need to say something that you know that makes that useful. So some context or some backstory to what it is you've written about. Always try and pick something out of content that you know something about. That makes it easier to add the O. So now essentially what our little paragraph is looking like now is we've got a judgment of the source is very useful for an inquiry into X, Y, or Z. And then you've said source C shows, in this case because it's a picture, and you've identified what it shows, and then you're going to say this is useful because I know that, or in context of the period, or this was around the time, or something like that. Some knowledge that you can give the examiner that backs up your quote. All right, so you could say content or quote, same kind of thing. All right, now they're the two easy bits, but of course you need to know stuff to be able to do the O, and that's where your revision comes in, and that's where all the preparation for learning facts and figures and stories about World War One, how they come in. And you can even bring in things of your own if you know your own little bits of the story, as long as it relates to the quote that you've picked out of the source. And then the last bit is P. All right, so the provenance, and people often struggle with this one. This is the most difficult bit, but actually it isn't really. So you got to think to yourself, looking at the provenance, it will always tell you the information. What is the source? Who made the source? When was it made? Why was it made? And any other sort of question that you can think of that might help. And you just need to pick out one bit of provenance, really. You can go on forever if you want to, but you haven't really got time. So just pick out one strong piece of provenance. We'll talk a little bit about provenance again in every single lesson because it's a key part of the source. So you've got this one paragraph, source C, we picked something out of it, some quote or some observation. We've backed it up with what we know about that. And then we think about what is the source, why was it made, who made it, or any of those kind of questions. So maybe in year 7, we might sort of think about the 5 W's of a source: who, what, where, why, when. That is fine, but you don't necessarily need to go into that much detail. Just look at it and something should hopefully jump out at you. Now, in this case, if we're seeing the 15th of September 1916, you might be seeing straight away, well, this is during the Battle of the Somme. All right, so you might be able to say some context around that. Then why does that make it useful? Because we know that there was many injuries in the Somme, many casualties, probably the biggest of the whole campaign. But look, it even says it. It says it in the caption, in the provenance. All right, so that is there to help us make sure that we use it. We might consider here that it's a photograph. All right, a photograph is really good. It captures a moment in time. This is a photograph that captured this exact scene. Now, yes, you might naturally want to be saying, oh, it's only one photograph, so how is this useful? But you need to think to yourself, is it typical? And that's a word that we probably want to be getting used to saying if it's a photograph that we're using, or a soldier's recollection. Is this the kind of thing you'd expect to see all along the Western Front? And actually, in a battle or following a battle, you would expect to see soldiers being carried. All right, so that is the kind of gist of what we need to be thinking and what we need to be doing on this. All right, so that is our COP. And you will do that twice because you'll have 2 sources to look at. The question will ask you, how useful are sources A and B, or B and C, or whatever it is, for an inquiry into something, injuries or the evacuation chain or whatever it might be. So you do source C first, or the first one first. So a judgment, it's very useful for an inquiry into. Make sure you use the words of the question, as always. Then you'll start with source C shows. I know that, which makes it more useful because, and a little bit of backstory, some own knowledge and some context. And then you'll end that paragraph with some provenance. The provenance makes it especially useful because this was a photograph captured in time, which shows an exact scene and is probably typical around the Western Front following a battle. And we'll talk about lots of different types of provenance. There are 2 that I really like. A museum is always a really good one, because you know if it's in a museum, it has to have been checked and checked and checked again by lots of historians because it needs to be accurate. So that in itself makes a source useful. So there are thousands of possible combinations of sources and provenance, but really the basic skill stays the same. You need to pick something out of that provenance, the writing that goes with the source, and say why that's useful. And then you repeat for the next source and you say source B, or whatever it is. Source D is also very useful for an inquiry into, and it will be the same inquiry question, and you just repeat COP. All right, so you're looking at essentially 2 paragraphs. They do not need to be compared. You do not need to say one source is more useful than the other. Just 2 paragraphs about why each source is useful for this inquiry question. All right, so with that said, I'll have a little pause of the video. If we make it a little bit bigger, so look at the source on the screen and just make some observations on the content or quotes, or in this case, what it shows. Some own knowledge that you might know or you can maybe work out from the picture. Maybe you could imply or infer something from what you can see. And then a bit of provenance. And when you've done that, unpause the video and we'll carry on. All right. We've generally spoken a little bit about it. But just practice this idea of picking something out, backing it up with own knowledge, and then pick a date and say why the date was important or why the photograph is important and makes it more useful. All right. Right, so hopefully we've been able to see, we can see some damage to terrain there. We probably see a bit of a train line. In this point, it's hard to do this bit of the task because there isn't a question. But that's not really the point of this. It just introduces the idea of picking something out, adding a bit of own knowledge and a bit of provenance practice. In real life, of course, you will have a specific question and a specific focus. In this case, you've just picked out there are 4 stretcher bearers carrying a stretcher, a patient, and you might be able to say, especially if you're watching this revision later on, that often the stretcher bearers work in 4s, 2s to 4s, something like that. As this is just an introduction, I'm just trying to get you to pick things out before we get into the content. All right, so our job is to work out how a source is useful, remember, not how it's not useful. So please don't do that. So let's have a little practice here. Again with this one, so if you were doing this in class, you'd be highlighting this source, but if you're watching it and you've got a Google Doc open or just a book or some paper, just write down any content of this source that particularly tells us what it was like to be an ambulance driver. So read it and think about just ambulance drivers during World War I. So we've now got a focus, unlike the start of this lesson. Write anything you can about the ambulance drivers. Once you've done that, unpause the video and carry on, and then we'll add a little bit of knowledge perhaps to think about that, but just then write a summary about what it was like to be an ambulance driver using that knowledge. There are plenty of things. Remember, in real life, you would only need to pick out one piece of content, one quote, but this lesson is just about practicing the skill. Once we get really good at the skill, then this course is dead easy, really. All right, so you've picked out some content, hopefully, about an ambulance driver. Anything else that you pick out is irrelevant. The one that always jumps out at me is right in the middle of this. The journeys back were a perfect nightmare. It was impossible to not bump a certain amount of those appalling roads full of holes and cobbles. And you would bring in some knowledge to that later on once you've learned this course about the shell fire, the bomb damage and things like that. You'll also be able to bring in some knowledge about these soldiers on the evacuation chain, how they're in agony. They've got certain injuries that every bump in the road is going to hurt them. Anything like that. For now, we don't really know anything because you're watching this for the first time. But if you are watching this as revision, then you do know some own knowledge that you can bring into one of these quotes. Okay. Next thing when we're thinking about on this is make a little bit of notes down about the provenance. Let's make a list of things that this source talks about in the provenance that we can find useful. So, for example, it's an autobiography from Pat Beecham. It's published in 1919, so the year after the war. But it tells us that Beecham was a nurse, bringing in the wounded from the trenches. So we can learn there that we know that the nurses drove some of the ambulances. And she's describing driving casualties to the base hospital. So yes, it may be one person's experience, but it is Pat Beecham's experience and is probably really typical of any ambulance driver listening to men in the back of their ambulance wailing out and crying in agony and along this journey along these broken bumpy roads. So make a list of all the things that you think are useful about the provenance, the text that always comes with a source. And then when you're ready, unpause the video and we'll carry on. All right, so a discussion on this, if we were in school, we might be discussing together what you've just picked out. But let's think about this. An autobiography is always a really good source, quite simply because it is that person's story, isn't it? It's about them. It's about their experience. It's published in 1919, so obviously that's the year after the war, which is very close to the war. If you want to go down that route, you can say the date. You can pick a date as provenance. That's useful because it's really close to the war, so actually it's going to be fairly fresh in her mind. Beecham is a nurse, so she definitely was there. She is the driver. She's heard this. These are her experiences. This is not second or third or fourth hand. She has been a driver and she is basing these notes in this book on what she went through. And that ultimately makes this source even more useful. All right. We can see that she's driving casualties to the base hospital. So we know that the drivers, the nurses, are in some way of the evacuation chain, probably between the CCS and the base hospital, the last port of call before you go home. But overall, that provenance makes this source, everything that this nurse says in this autobiography is just incredibly useful because it's accurate. We know it's accurate because we know these things happened, and also it's based on her own experience. All right, so hopefully you're starting to see how this thing works. All right, so let's think about the types of sources we can use to find out more. So we could use articles and journals from surgeons and nurses and doctors who were there. Now that's the key bit, is they were there. So surgeons, nurses, doctors, they've done the operations, they've driven the ambulances, they've cared for the patients. They were there. That means whatever they say has a value, is useful. Now then, if we want to think about maybe in the provenance of why the source was made, whichever source our exam board have picked for you in your exam, usually speaking, articles or journals would be used for training, wouldn't they, for future surgeons, doctors or nurses going out to the Western Front to know kind of the procedures of what's now currently going on. And therefore it would be accurate and have to be truthful. Why would you put wrong information in a journal or article that was maybe used for training? Therefore that probably makes it more useful. All right, so that's the kind of language that you need to be regularly using in this course. Then photographs sometimes seem easy because they're a picture and you can see stuff, but sometimes as well it's a bit harder to pick things out than if it was an actual text. But in this case, always generally think about photographs being a moment in time, a captured moment in time that either shows us something that somebody wants us to see. So that might be an official photograph, perhaps for training purposes or for the government reporting back on an event, or a private photograph just taken by a soldier in the trenches for their own collection or their own sort of story of the war. Still useful. All sources are useful, but that just captures a moment that tells us something, and we can work that out. Remember that a photograph, the content will show us something, but we can often see something extra that wasn't really intended. In this case, the photograph you're looking at right now on the screen, you can see the mud, and we can see many stretcher bearers carrying stretchers. So we know about the stretcher bearers, but we can also pick out something about the mud, talking about how it was difficult to transport soldiers or get them from the battlefields into the evacuation chain. But also battles like Passchendaele might come to mind when you think about the muddy conditions there. So it allows us to bring in a bit of own knowledge, sometimes with an unintended feature of the photograph. But generally photographs are really good because they capture a moment and will be used for the training purposes or reporting somewhere to the government probably. Then we get National Army records and statistics. This is probably going to be our go-to really. So this will tell us things like how many people died in a battle, of what injuries, how many nurses were there, stuff like that, all sorts of things, unlimited information that we could find from army records that will help us in this exam paper find out more. And the third question of this part of the paper one, the trenches part, is essentially asking you as a historian, how would you follow up one of the sources that we've already talked about in the source question? How would you find out more? And we need in that question to pick out a source. And this is kind of where this part of the online lesson is looking at now. The types of sources you might pick to say, I will use army records from the Battle of the Somme on the Western Front or something to help you answer a specific question. We'll talk about that part of the exam paper in this course, in many of the lessons in this trenches course. But generally speaking, you'll be saying something like, I want to find out more about how many people got trench foot, and then that would be your question that you've created, and then the source that you would use to find out, you could use army records or statistics from a base hospital on the Western Front or something. So for now that doesn't really make much sense to you, but it will do as we get through this course. And of course, if you're watching this as a year 11 ready for your exam, or year 10 for mock exams perhaps, you will already know some of those features of that question, and you can already be thinking about that. So then we get hospital records. Now I would recommend to you that this is your standby go-to source. In that question where you have to ask a question and then follow it up with a specific source, I would say to you to just try and always be prepared and ready to say if it fits the question, and I think about 70% of the time it will, is you will say something like, the source I will use are medical records from a base hospital or from a casualty clearance station on the Western Front. That generally covers all sorts, and because this course is about medicine and injuries in the trenches, as well as obviously the environment, generally speaking, we can get away with that. So always be prepared to say medical records from a base hospital or a casualty clearance station or a regimental aid post, depending on what the question's about. So if it's about a stretcher bearer, then more likely it's going to be about the RAP. But if it's about a more serious condition, then it's going to be hospital records. on the Western Front. It's really important that you don't just say medical records. You have to say medical records from a casualty clearance station or a base hospital on the Western Front. So medical records generally fit. Now, if we're talking about the RAP, there probably weren't many medical records. I don't think they wrote that much down, if anything at all. They treated you, didn't they? And they moved you on as quick as possible. So generally speaking, we might be able to see from the regimental aid post and the medics involved that there'll be a number of stretcher bearers assigned to that regiment. But that's your sort of go-to, okay? And then we might have some personal accounts, some diaries, poetry that the soldiers have written while they've been sat in the trenches, medical treatments from doctors, nurses and patients, just talking about what happened to them. We've seen our source already in this video of the nurse talking about the men in the back of the ambulance crying and shouting and wailing. Those kind of sources are really, really vital in giving us an insight into the personal experiences in the trenches rather than the bigger picture. So we're getting a bit of a collection of sources here that we can use as sources to help us find out more. But just make sure that when you are doing that question, that it still relates to the focus of the question. Like I say, we'll talk about more of this as we go through this course, and also in the feedback videos for your mock exams that you'll find on our website as well at stchistory.com, which talks through every exam paper and every question in a lot of detail. The common mistake people make is they just don't write about the focus of the question. The bit that you're trying to follow up has to relate to the focus of the question. So if it's asking you about the evacuation chain and you ask a question about, I don't know, lice or rats, that's not helpful and you're not going to get any marks. Even if your technique is right, it has to be about whatever the focus of the question is. All right, so let's have a little practice. All that said, now we're near enough done with this part of the lesson, the introduction to the skills of it. There's a source here, source A. So if you just pause the video and put everything we've said into this lesson into practice, the focus is treatment in World War One. So what can we learn? So just write down any sort of content or quotes that you can pick out. Remember the C, picking something out. So source A says. In this case, because it's a text, source A says, but it's about treatment. And once you've done that, unpause the video and come back. Then start your bullet point list again of the source's provenance. What are we learning about the provenance and why does the provenance make this source useful? All right. And then make sure you have fully stated why. And this, again, is the absolute rule of this question that people get wrong all the time. They say this is an interview with a gunner. Fine, full stop. They get no marks for that. You need to say why that's useful. All right, please, please, please always remember that. So like we said at the start of this video, a lot of it is very much technique, but there are hoops to jump through. And if you miss these hoops, you are absolutely hurting your chances in this question. So please, please, please remember to say why the provenance makes it useful. Don't just say this is from an interview with Gunner William Towers. Okay. So that's something to practice. Have a go, unpause the video, and then we'll finish off looking at some photographs from World War One, just to get you practicing and thinking about some of the things that we could talk about. All right, so hopefully you've realised this is obviously talking about how they've amputated legs. That tells us that treatments, and we know these things, or you will know these things if you're watching this as catch-up. They were done in the CCS and the base hospital, obviously for the different type of injuries, shrapnel wounds to the legs and things like that. You'll be able to bring in some more knowledge later on as well about how most of the injuries were to the legs and bodies, because they are the ones that are open as they're going across no man's land and more vulnerable. So that would be your own knowledge that you would bring in. But this source is really good for treatments. It tells us quite a lot, and the provenance of the thing. The guy was there, all right, Gunner William Towers. He's recalling his treatment following a wound to his leg when he was at the Battle of Ypres in 1917, so probably around the Battle of Passchendaele. So this is really useful because it's his own experience, okay? And again, you might want to say naturally, but it's only one soldier, so that's not very useful. Use your word typical. Typical is your way away from negative to become positive. This is a very typical experience of any soldier who had a leg injury during the Battle of the Somme or Battle of Passchendaele or any battle. If they were in the base hospital or the CCS because they've had a leg injury, then they've had an amputation, this is very typical. This is probably the exact same experience they'll all have faced because there was a routine about the thing, okay? So for this next bit of the lesson, I'm just going to put lots of photographs on for you to have a look at. But practice what we've done in this this lesson with your skills. Just look at the photographs, write down things that you see, just make observations. Now, obviously, it's difficult because there are no inquiry questions to go with it. But as I said, this is just about getting you thinking about the skills and practicing picking stuff out. They're all photographs. They're all useful because they're from the Imperial War Museum. So they've been checked and checked and checked again. Just write down what you see. And then they will be accompanied by a little yellow box that basically gives you some backstory to what the photograph is from. Maybe think about some provenance from that if you can, but also might be including some information you could use as own knowledge. If you are watching this again as revision, then you should be able to add your own knowledge already. But if you're watching this because you missed the lesson for the first time, then obviously you can't add any particular own knowledge other than what's in the yellow box. So your job for now is just to practice picking out the C, some content. All right, so pause the video on each picture and then unpause and work your way to the end of this lesson. And as always, if you need any questions, if you've got any questions, ask your teachers. All right, so picture 1. Okay, so hopefully this exercise has proven useful and just given you a little insight into the actual World War One experience of these soldiers, the evacuation chain, transporting soldiers, the types of weapons used, the injuries. This particular photograph is really good. You can see all these soldiers are in this place getting some sort of treatment. Perhaps the first one you might recognize, the one who's got the arm in a sling, a bit of maybe shell shock in his eyes, a man behind having his arm dealt with. You can just sort of make out all sorts of bits in here. With own knowledge, you can understand that this is a cramped thing, probably following a battle. But all the photographs you've looked at there, hopefully you've been able to pick out some important information just to get that skill of content alone, just picking out information. All right. So as always, thank you very much for watching. Hopefully this was useful. And if you have any questions, please ask your teachers. But that is our introduction to the trenches course. As we go forward now, it will be about content and always using that content in the context of an exam question. How is this useful and how can we use this as own knowledge? All right. So once again, thank you very much and we'll see you for the next video.